Good morning from Vienna. Thank you very much for your kind invitation for me to join your conference. In fact, I was planning to come and join you in person, but unfortunately the agenda of this organization has become, as you know, very complicated. And I have to be in Vienna for important discussions on Ukraine that are taking place exactly today with the presence of the chief monitor of our monitoring operation in Ukraine. But still, I welcome the opportunity of sharing with you some thoughts on the role of the OSCE today, as we are looking at the marking of the 40th anniversary of the signing of the final act in Helsinki in 1975, and looking back at where the organization is coming from, looking at its agenda today, and what are the prospects. So let me say at the outset that as I look at the OSCE and what the OSCE does today, I cannot avoid remembering what the CSE was at the time when I was a young Italian delegate at the Vienna Review Conference in the 80s. And this was the CSE. It was a time when we had the Warsaw Pact still in place and the Soviet Union, and where there were difficult discussions between East and West, with a strong mediating role of the so-called neutral and non-aligned countries. Obviously, a completely different lineup from what we see today, with the expansion of the alliance, with the development, the strong development of the European Union, who is today more than ever a very strong and very active player in the OSCE. But still, one element is resurfacing from that time, and that is the polarization and the rather confrontational tone that is emerging in the dealings in the organization, and that is making the decision-making process much more complicated. So, what is the OSCE, and why the OSCE today has a more visible role in addressing some of the issues that are on the agenda of us all Europeans? And let me, for a moment, since I'm addressing also the European movement, focus on the differences, if you want, between the European Union and the OSCE. And I think if you walk back and look at them at a distance, we see certain commonalities, and the fact that we stand largely for same principles. The OSCE has become a principle-based organization, and this is one of the reasons why we have a crisis. There is a big debate about the implementation of the principles, the need to stand by them, the need to act on their violation, but also debate about the conditions of the implementation of the principles that some argue are taking place in a context that is dramatically different from the context in which these principles were adopted, and therefore the implementation should take note of the conditions in which, in a way, those principles were approved and the conditions in which those principles are applied today. A complicated debate, but a debate that should not distract us from the value of those principles, the importance of those principles, and the need to ensure that those remain an important guideline in the way we proceed and the way we manage our own relation as European countries. So this I would say is an important commonality, because obviously the European Union shares these principles and does a lot in terms of promoting their implementation in its own midst and among its own member states. But the OSCE is obviously broader than that. The European Union represents increasingly a group of countries that are in many ways like-minded. In some areas, obviously, there are differences. We see this every day. But it's really working to eliminate those differences and to continue promoting common goals and common objectives. The OSCE is built in a very different way. The OSCE keeps together countries that do recognize that they have very different objectives, very different policies, The OSCE doesn't really have as a goal that of harmonizing these different goals, but takes into account the fact that countries have different perspectives of the same problem and tries to bridge the differences to build trust using the toolbox that has been developed by the different countries, and so to create a space of security and a space of stability in a context that is broader than the context of the European Union. Therefore, we look at a space that is at the same time Euro-Atlantic, covering a little bit the political space covered by NATO, but also Eurasian, and looking at the space of the former Soviet Union. We had Mongolia joining, and developing an agenda that does cover and does bring together the different perspectives that emanate by countries that are operating in these spaces. Ukraine is today, as I said, bringing to the fore a number of problems, having to do with the implementation of the principles, but also larger problems having to do with the relationship between the various constituencies, various political constituencies in the space of the OSCE. And because of its inclusive nature, you shouldn't forget the fact that also decisions are taken in the OSCE by consensus. So in a way, every country has a veto power. So this is making the decision-making process very challenging, sometimes frustrating. But then it is giving also to whatever decision is adopted in the OSCE a strong legitimacy, because then we know that every country in this space is behind those decisions. Those decisions are not taken against anybody, but they are taken with the active involvement and approval of everybody. This is an element of strength, and this has been an element of strength for the OSCE as it operates, for instance, in Ukraine. The monitoring operation that is taking place today on the Ukrainian territory is, of course, requested by Ukraine as the host country, but it's approved by the West, by the countries of NATO, by the countries of the European Union, by the Russian Federation, and the countries in the Eurasian space. It's led by a Turk, a senior figure in the foreign service, in the Turkish foreign service. And in a way, it represents the diversity of the OSCE family. And the same happens when you look at the composition of the mission, which is truly multinational. There are teams that include representatives from all of these countries. They don't include national units. And there is a debate about the presence of some Russian monitors in Ukraine. Those monitors do operate in the context of multinational groups, along with colleagues from Western countries, from NATO countries. And so this presence is really embedded in the mission. It's an integral part of that mission, and in a way is also showing how the OSCE works in an inclusive manner. Should we be selective in hiring our staff? We would then run the risk of representing one of the communities of like-minded countries in the context of the organization, and then we would become, in a way, politically also engaging on one or another side. By including everybody, we continue to remain politically neutral. Of course, we have, and we are monitoring ourselves how our monitors perform. So we are also taking good note of how they operate and deal with any issues or problems should we become aware of any. So that's why the OSCE manages in a way to engage. The fact that it represents everybody, the fact that it involves everybody, the fact that it reports everybody allows us to be the eyes of the international community in the midst of a crisis that is very much at the center, if you want, of the European security agenda, that it's also of great concern to all of us, because it needs to be addressed in a robust manner to avoid that this crisis may spread even beyond its present confines. The crisis in Ukraine also, I wouldn't take it in isolation, but the OSCE has been dealing now for a number of years with the crisis in its space, in the former Yugoslavia, first of all, but also in the former Soviet space, let's call it this way. And if you look at Transnistria, if you look at Abkhazia or South Ossetia, or even Nagorno-Karabakh in a different way perhaps there, but we see that some of the issues that we have on the table in Ukraine and some of the dynamics that we see in play in Ukraine are replicating some of the things we've seen in some of these other places. So there is an issue of policies and policies of certain capitals, advancing political objectives that collide with the principles of the organization. And just Crimea, let me remind you of this as a clear example of a violation of some fundamental principles of the organization, but also shows that what we somehow were taking for granted, the settlement, the post-Cold War settlement in the former Soviet space, maybe shouldn't be taken so much for granted, and we need to engage and to redouble our efforts to ensure that every development takes place in a mode that is promoting security and stability and not generating risk of conflict. So this is why we as the OSCE found out that the toolbox of the OSCE, which is very relevant for situations like this, because the OSCE was created, as I was saying at the beginning, in a context that was a potentially confrontational context, have become and have shown to be very relevant to address conflict situations like the one we're facing today. So whatever the angle, the issue of national minorities, whether this is in Crimea, whether it's in eastern Ukraine, or even in other parts of Ukraine, or in other parts of the space where we operate, is a very modern tool, and we've been using this consistently. We've been using it before the crisis in relation to issues related to the Crimean Tatars. The questions revolving around the freedom of the media and the role of the media, it's very disturbing to see the role that the media have played in relation to the conflict that we are dealing with now. The narratives are clashing in a way. There is a lot of confrontation through the media. And we are discussing internally also, and in meetings that we organize here in Vienna, the role of the media in relation to conflicts. And we would like to turn the discussion into how to use the media in a positive role to address some of the issues that are on the table and to try to create stability rather than promoting conflict and instability, as unfortunately we see this to be the case too often in this crisis in and around Crimea. The elections, the work that the OSCE has done on elections in assisting the preparation and also the monitoring the elections both at the presidential level and the parliamentary election in Ukraine. We had the largest monitoring operations of the OSCE in Ukraine over the last year. We are planning to monitor local elections in eastern Ukraine once the working group will have agreed on a roadmap for that and on the modalities for the holding of those elections. So the agenda remains complex, but the organization has the tools to continue providing support. The role of the chairmanship, the role of Ambassador Tagliavini as a representative of the chairmanship in the context of the working groups that operate in the context of the trilateral working group and on the implementation of the Minsk agreement remains key. I think as we manage to calm down for this moment the situation on the ground, and yes, there are violations of the ceasefire, especially around the Donetsk airport, but all in all, the ceasefire seems to be holding in this phase. So this is a good phase to try to accelerate the political process, and this is what we are engaging in these days, to try to get these working groups up and running. And of course, there are lots of sensitive issues and complicated issues that need to be addressed in that context, but this is also a moment of great opportunity. So we really want to invest as much as we can these days to contribute to de-escalation and to contribute to identify the elements, the next steps that would make also the current ceasefire on the ground more solid, more durable, and sustainable also on the basis of a better agreed agenda on every other point. In a couple of months, we will go to Helsinki to mark, as I said, the 40th anniversary. The chairmanship is thinking of a high-level event, which could also involve ministers or high-level officials. This will remain to be clarified in the next few days. We want to use this not only to look back at where we've come over the last 40 years and the problems that we have now on the agenda of the organization, but we want to use this also to engage ministers in a dynamic discussion on the future role of the OSCE, given the complicated agenda we have in front of us, identifying the key issues for us, but also identifying also ways to make the organization in a way more efficient and better, or even better, able to respond to the kind of new challenges that we find on our common agenda today. So thank you very much. I was happy to provide a short perspective from my side, and I wish you all the best and all the success for the deliberations in the course of the day. Thank you very much.